Hi, good evening. Uh, we're going to learn together that part of the Haggadah, which is sort of the end of Magid, the end of telling the story. Now, we know that in the Haggadah, the story is told by steps. It doesn't flow into a story. That's it. What it is the basic information needed to tell the story, but it's not the story. And apparently the story that you tell on Pesach, because it has to do with your children, has to do with Yetziat Mitzrayim, has to do with coming to Eretz Yisrael, has to do with a variety of things that the story begs that each of us pull together somehow into a story. Because there isn't what we would call a story in the Haggadah. And yet the storytelling part of the Haggadah ends with this statement of Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel haya omer. Rabban Gamliel was one to say, I mean, to remember that we're talking probably about Rabban Gamliel and Yavne. And that Rabban Gamliel was lived after the Churban Beit HaMikdash. And so it's likely that the Haggadah, as we know it, was just beginning to take its form, right? I mean, it's true that some of the Haggadah is taught to us in the Mishnah. The Mishnah has what we would call the Haggadah in it. But there were later additions. I mean, the Haggadah was a living kind of document that people used because it helped them to tell the story. But they didn't think it was the story. Today, there are apparently so many commentaries on the Haggadah. It's probably the most commented book in Jewish history. There's so many books that are, so many commentaries that try to understand the flow of things in the Haggadah. And that's one of the great things about it, that it's like it's not so easy. It leaves you with the feeling that you could still do better. You could get it together in a better way. And so the end of the Magid that comes before the Achilat HaSeudah, before eating the meal of Pesach, includes this statement by Rabban Gamliel of Yavna, apparently. Hu haya omer, kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim, hu haya omer. In other words, he used to say it in his Seder every year. And sometimes people followed him and other people did not. But haya omer, kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu b'Pesach. I mean, there was some kind of a difference of opinion that is reflected in the words of Rabban Gamliel. Kol shelo amar, he's taking a strong stand. How could there be people who didn't follow his directive? Kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu b'Pesach, lo yatsa yedei chovato. If you just allow the story to ramble on, if you just tell the story as it is told clearly in the Torah, that's not good enough. There are three things that have to be specifically noted, Rabban Gamliel, three things that make up the essence, the kernel of the story. And that story cannot be told unless you tell the story of Pesach, of Matzah, and Maror. Now, this seems perhaps to be kind of simple, straightforward. But in spite of that fact, Rabbi Gamliel adds an explanation. He explains what is Pesach and what is Matzah and what is Maror. I don't mean what the translation of the words is. What I mean is what's the story? What's the story that we're supposed to tell? Pesach, שהיו אבותינו אוכלים בזמן שבית המקדש היה קיים על שuma Pesach. So first, the explanation to the words of Rabbi Gamliel starts out by explaining that the word Pesach refers also to the Korban Pesach. And Ayu Avotenu Ochlim, our forefathers would eat the Korban Pesach Bizman Beit HaMikdash Haya Kayam, during the time that the Beit HaMikdash was excellent. Al Shuma. So you rephrase the question. It's not just Pesach, but includes the Churban Beit HaMikdash. And it includes the idea that it's no longer in existence. Al Shum, so but why was it called the Korban Pesach? Of all the Korbanot, it could have been called the Korban Chag HaMatzot. But no, it's called the Korban Pesach, Al Shumah. Why was the name Pesach so important? Al Shum Shepasach HaKadosh Baruch Hu Al Batei Avotenu BeMitzrayim Shne'emar V'amartem Zevach Pesach Hu L'Hashem Asher Pasach Al Batei Bnei Yisrael BeMitzrayim V'nakvo et Mitzrayim et Bateinu Yitzil V'yikod Ha'am V'yishtachavu. Let's translate. Pesach, the third line. Oy, the third line. Pesach refers to the korban that we participated in when we ate on the night of Pesach, on the night of the Seder. Bizman Beit HaMikdash Haya Kayam. This reminds us, as I said, of the fact that this korban, Beit HaMikdash, the destruction of the temple, and no longer is there a korban Pesach. So why do we call that korban Pesach? The word Pesach doesn't mean korban, and the holiday that we're talking about is not. It's more reasonably called Chag HaMatzot than Chag HaPesach. Al Shuma, the end of that first line. Al Shum meaning because. Shepasach HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That means in the Yetziat Mitzrayim story, there's a Pesach notation. Pasach HaKadosh Baruch Hu al Batei Avoteinu b'Mitzrayim. God skipped over the houses of our forefathers. In Mitzrayim, I'm not sure exactly what it means. I mean, skipped over, it sounds like the houses of Bnei Yisrael in Mitzrayim were kind of interspersed within the Egyptian houses, and that God killed the Egyptians, but not the Jews. But we know that the Jews lived in a separate neighborhood in Goshen, and was not really involved with the people who lived in the Egyptian cities. All right, Shne'emar, and then the pasuk is quoted, V'amartem, and this is what you should say. Zebach Pesach Hayali. There was a korban Pesach, a sacrifice, a special sacrifice given for Yetziat Mitzrayim, the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim, Pesach Mitzrayim. You took the sheep, you slaughtered it, you put the blood on the mezuzah, on the mezuzot of the doorpost of your house, and that guaranteed that the Malach HaMavet would skip over your home. Asher Pasach means to skip in Hebrew. Al batei b'nei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim b'nakvot Mitzrayim et bateinu hitzil. Skipped over the houses of Bnei Yisrael in Mitzrayim when he brought the plague down upon the Mitzrim, on the Egyptians, and our houses were saved by Kod Ha'am Vayishtachabu, and the people bowed down. The people bowed down because they suddenly realized that God was watching over them. And that is the point of one of the points, according to Rabbi Gamliel, one of the points of the story that has to be told is the awareness that the Jews had this awareness that God was watching over them, was taking care of them. And even though they lived in proximity to this great plague, they were all together with the Egyptians, the object of the plague. Nevertheless, they came out of it unscathed. Pesach. So Rabbi Gamliel said, first of all, it's Pesach, and the commentary says, Pesach means even though we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, even though there's no Beit HaMikdash, we remember that the Pesach was eaten by Bnei Yisrael at the time of the Beit HaMikdash. So this is I think, is a theme in many sections of the Haggadah. That even though the Haggadah is about the great salvation of the Jewish people, but it's affected by history. It's affected by the fact that we are no longer exactly as we were at that time, at the moment of Yetziat Mitzrayim. We were then filled with hope and yearning for the Beit HaMikdash that we had never seen. I mean, there was a Mishkan, a tabernacle, but there was no Beit HaMikdash. The tabernacle is not comparable to what was built finally by Shlomo the king. He has the Beit HaMikdash. So that's the first thing that Rabbi Gamliel says, and something that we have to take note of. And somehow, life goes on, I think. It doesn't mean you tell a story. It doesn't mean that we feel that everything stays the same. Nothing has ever changed. I don't want to be politically connected, but we have a problem. We have a problem in Israel. Things are not quite as we would like them to be. We're not getting into it. We could all get into it whenever we have the time, but things are not exactly as they could be, and that's also Pesach. Pesach, the story of Pesach teaches us somehow that whatever happens, I mean, even history has to be maintained. You can't just expect Yetziat Mitzrayim to last forever. You just leave Mitzrayim and that's the end of it. But we are always put to the test. Are we worthy? Do we understand? Are we appreciative of what happened? On and on. I mean, that's the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. We have this idea that we have to keep telling the story in order to make sure that we still deserve the story. The history for us is not an academic subject, even though academic subjects are very positive. What the academic world produces is generally, and I have found, very positive. But it doesn't focus upon the ongoing implications of things. And that's what Rabbi Gamliel said. Pesach is a story that has implications even today, because today was very much like his time. So we see again Rabbi Gamliel Hayaomer. Rabbi Gamliel would say all year long, all Seder, Kol shelo abash shlosha dvarim elu b'Pesach lo yatsa yedei chovato. If you're not included in the story, if the story is not about your Yetziat Mitzrayim, if the story is not about what it points to, it doesn't point to the tragedies of other nations and other times and other places. It's not about Biafra, it's not about South Africa. It's about us. Us, even those of us who live in Eretz Yisrael, have a story to tell. Have a story to tell. The second thing that Rabbi Gamliel taught us about was matzah. Matzah, zo shanu ochlim, we eat it. That's true, we're about to eat the matzah. Shanu ochlim al shulma, why do we eat a piece of matzah? That's like a question. We can answer that question. But Rabbi Gamliel answers it, or the Haggadah answers it for us. Al shum, because shelo speak b'tzeikav shel avotenu lachmitz, ad shenigla aleihem melech malchei hamlachim. Kadosh Baruch Hu, Ugala. Says we were leaving Mitzrayim. Shelo speak habatzek, batzek, which could end up as being a matzah, or could end up being a pita. Lo speak b'tzeikam shel avotenu lachmitz. It just wasn't in the oven long enough. Wasn't in the oven long enough. Lachmitz, to turn into a pita. Ad shegigla alehem melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu, until they were aware of God's salvation. In other words, I think that what Rabbi Gamliel is saying is that everybody would have wanted to leave the dough in the oven a little bit longer so they would have bread. They didn't want matzah. They didn't want matzah. But lo, he speak b'tzeikam shel avotenu lachmitz. It wasn't in the oven long enough to produce the pita. Ad shenigla aleihem melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu. And they somehow realized that you don't, even in Geula, even in a redemptive time, you don't always get what you want. You don't always get what you think you need. But Geula redemption, right? That's what the Nigla Aleihem Melech Malchei Hamlachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God appeared to them, was known to them. He became a world of God's presence, and not a world in which we do what the little things that we do in our lives. Ad shenigla aleihem melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu u'ga'alam. Geula, redemption, means close. And in the world of God, in the world that God is more involved in, where you feel the involvement of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it was matzah. It was matzah that you had to have. Shelo speak b'tzeikam shel avotenu lachmitz. It could not produce what they really wanted. It produced what God wanted, and that's the story of the matzah. That God took them out of Mitzrayim. God took them out. That means something. It doesn't just mean, well, they got out of Mitzrayim. And since God does everything, so Mitzvah, God did that as well. No, that's not what it is. Again, another pasuk, we have batzek, and they took the dough and they put it into the oven. Asher hotzim Mitzrayim ugot matzot, ilo chametz. There's a world in which there's a distinction that could be made between matzot and chametz. Matzot, a very short time in the oven. Chametz, very long time. And this became one of the main enterprises of Pesach. Make sure that the matzah, which is made exactly the same way as bread, well, not exactly, but is made the same way as bread, the matzah. Ugot matzot kilo chametz. Kilo chametz is an addition. In other words, you could say ugot matzot. They made matzot because they didn't have time. They had to get the thing out of the oven. They had to get the sheets of matzahs out of the oven and take them with them running away so they have something to eat. But the pasuk adds kilo chametz. All of a sudden they understood something. It wasn't just that they were getting matzahs to eat and not bread. That's true. They got matzahs to eat. They didn't have bread to eat. That's all true. But they also got kilo chametz. They became aware of a new distinction. I mean, they knew what a matzah is. They knew what bread is. But all of a sudden, the pasuk says, listen, Yetziat Mitzrayim is something you do with matzah, and you don't do it with chametz. And that idea was new. It was new, and over the generations, we've tried to understand. All the people who keep the halacha and do a Seder and try to understand what the Seder is leading us to. Here's Rabbi Gamliel says, Matzah, lo chametz. Lo chametz, wow. I never thought of that. Never thought of ki lo chametz. Ki gorshu mi Mitzrayim. Gorshu mi Mitzrayim. Gorshu is a negative word. They were chased out of Mitzrayim. V'lo yachlu litmamea. In other words, it's almost the saying, if they didn't run out of Mitzrayim, maybe the deal would end. Maybe they wouldn't be able to leave. Lo yachlu litmamea. They couldn't just waste any time. V'gam tzeidah lo asu lahem. So they were entirely in the hands of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Entirely in the hands of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. And so the matzah is something that they had to have. We may not know exactly why. They didn't even have food to eat. So they were dependent. They were entirely dependent on a Kadosh Baruch Hu and had to, it's like to say, people, it's a difference between being able to say, oh, so-and-so helps me out, or I'm dependent on somebody, and to understand it. Understand what dependency is. Understand how it is that a Kadosh Baruch Hu is. Ocheza Maror, it says, Biyado Umareo Talnam Subin, and this is the third thing that Rabbi Gamliel asked us to think about. The third thing that he asked us to think about was Maror. You hold up the Maror and you say, Maror Zeh Shanu Ochlim. Al Shuman, Rabbi Gamliel said, this is the story. The Maror is part of the story. Al Shebeiru HaMitzrim et Chayei Avotenu b'Mitzrayim. Because the Egyptians made life bitter for our forefathers of Mitzrayim. I mean, what do we need the Maror for? Al Shum Shemeiru. What does Meiru mean? What is Meiru? Meiru, they made everything bitter. Et Chayei Avotenu b'Mitzrayim. Why our fathers were in Mitzrayim. Shneamar, quoting the pasuk, Vayimaru et chayehem ba'avodah kasha, and they made their lives bitter, ba'avodah kasha, b'chomer bilbeinim. So they didn't give them. It's not because they gave them maror to eat, bitter herbs. They ate whatever they ate, but their life was bitter. So it's like a metaphor. You're eating a metaphor. Et chayei avoteinu b'Mitzrayim shneamar, vayimaru et chayehem ba'avodah kasha, b'chomer bilbeinim, with mortar, with stones, b'kol avodah b'sadeh, all the things, the labors of the field, kol avodatam asher avdu lahem b'farech. So there's a story. There's a story that has to do with the maror. And the story is that there was a bitterness in the situation that they had in Mitzrayim. And that bitterness was the slavery, the work, the magnitude of the oppression of the Jewish people in Mitzrayim. Et kol avodatam asher avdu bahem befarech, all of the labor that they labored and worked at with great oppression. So that the maror says, the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim is not that they got up one day and Hashem said to Moshe, okay, let's go. And Moshe said to Bnei Israel, let's go, and they all went. But the maror says that the avodah left an indelible impression upon Am Yisrael. They understood something about social realities. They understood that the pain of unfair labor, of labor that doesn't produce any positive result for the laborers. It says all of that is part of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and that's why we eat the maror. So we eat the maror because we say, it's bitter now. We haven't quite solved all these problems. We haven't, so to speak, put it all back together again in the way that we would have liked to. So maror zeh she'eno ochlim, again, maror zeh she'eno ochlim, let me just underline it. Al shum ma, why do we have to tell the story of the maror? Al shum she'meiru ha-mitzrim et chayei avoteinu v'mitzrayim. Because that's what the Egyptians did to our forefathers. When did they do it? All of the years of their slavery in Egypt. How many years were they enslaved in Egypt? 200, 210. So that's part of the story. Slavery changes you. Slavery makes you think about things that you didn't think about previously. Shneamar, and that's what the pasuk means by Yimaru et chayehem ba'avodah kasha b'chomer lebeinim b'chol avodah b'sadeh et kol avodatam asher avdu b'hem beparach. They, the Mitzrim, the Egyptians, did everything in their power to make the labor unreasonable, difficult, oppressive. And that was a lesson of Mitzrayim, that people have difficulty when given authority over other people. And it's something that has to be considered as part of the lesson of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Do we want to be enslavers of others. I mean, something to think about. It happens to come up at an odd time, something that we should think about from time to time, if we can. So Rabbi Gamliel had this to say: even though the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim can be told in many ways, there has to be a framework which we use to get to the essential story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. I mean, everybody can say whatever they want. Everybody can teach or learn on the night of Pesach, whatever it is that comes to mind, as long as it fulfills the obligation of telling the story. But Rabbi Gamliel said there's a little bit too much, a little too liberal here. A little too liberal about. And therefore he construed this summary Maggid statement, which we all say when we learn the Haggadah, because it made its way into the Haggadah. Rabbi Gamliel was so strong about this point. Is kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu pesach lo yatsa yedei chovato. Now that's you imagine Rabbi Gamliel going around and telling people that they didn't do the mitzvah? I mean, most mitzvahs are clearly defined. They're clearly defined. You eat a matzah, no one can tell you didn't eat it. So according to the way we have it written in the Haggadah, Pesach refers to something that either something that no longer exists, the Korban Pesach, or the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu destroyed the Egyptians while leaving the Jews to live. Then matzah represents perhaps that Ashu Shelo speak b'tzeikam shel avotam lachmitz. It was things were not yet finished. Yetziat Mitzrayim happened quickly. There was nothing, we couldn't wait for the bread to become bread. And that created a world in the story, whereas for some reason we've understood that we should recreate that world, the world of matzah. Matzah, but this defines to a certain extent the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And when we eat a matzah, we're very much aware of the fact that we're not eating chametz. Very much aware of the fact. I mean, maybe some people can go into the local grocery and buy matzah, but you know that beyond that matzah that you buy in the grocery is a legion of people who are trying to make sure that the matzah that you buy, again in the grocery, is worthy. Worthy meaning totally devoid of any connection to chametz. And that probably has something to do with time. That things happen, sometimes things happen quickly, they can't be controlled. And the only way to repeat them or to tell the story is to do it quickly. Whatever it was, there's always, I tell the story of Tzvi Pesach Frank, who used to do the Seder very quickly. He was the Rabbi of Yerushalayim. He used to do the Seder very quickly. Because he said that after drinking 4 cups of wine, he wouldn't be able to paskin a shaila. He wouldn't be able to make halachic determinations because he would be considered to be a drunk. So what he did was he said the Seder. He said the Haggadah very quickly. He drank the 4 cups of wine, and then went to sleep for an hour. And he got up. So legally, he was not considered a drunk. He could answer the shilas that come to him, so that every person can find in himself sometimes the need for speed, for moving quickly along, for letting it happen. That's the matzah. That is the matzah. So, okay. Okay, so we talked a little about the Pesach Matzah Moror. I wish you all a Chag Hashem Sameach, and it's almost Rosh Chodesh.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a great week.
Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Be
Thank
well.
you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a Chag Hashem Sameach.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you, Rabbi Brovender. Chag Sameach.
Toda rabba. Chag Sameach.
Thank you and Chag Sameach.